Welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, presenting Speaking Through History, Poetry of Persona. I'm Erin Donovan, Associate with the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thank you for joining us. A couple notes before we begin. Please share your questions for the authors using the Q&A tab on Zoom. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's books, we hope that you will. For details about how to buy them through a local bookseller, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. And while you're there, we hope that you'll consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. Thanks to our bookseller for this event, UVA Bookstore, and now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator. Erika Meitner is a professor of English at Virginia Tech. Her most recent book, Holy Moly, Carry Me, was the winner of the 2018 National Jewish Book Award and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry. Her sixth book, Useful Junk, will be published by BOA Editions in April 2022. Erika, it's all yours.
Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to be here to introduce the two poets who are going to be reading today. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're reading. And then we are going to open this up for questions from the audience. I also have some questions for the poets. So Annie Kim, who will be reading first, is the author of Eros, Unbroken, which is this book, winner of the 2021 Library of Virginia Literary Award in Poetry and the Washington Poetry Prize, and Into the Cyclorama, winner of the Michael Waters Poetry Prize. A former attorney, Annie works as an assistant dean at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she teaches law students about public interest lawyering and advocacy and directs the program in law and public service. In her spare time, she plays violin with the Waynesboro Symphony. And Annie's going to be reading first, and then we're going to have Shara McCallum. So I'm going to let Annie go ahead and read. And then when Annie's finished reading, I will introduce Shara. I do want to say before we get going that I'm really excited about having these books in conversation with one another, because Shara's book mythologizes the poet Robert Burns and his imagined Jamaican descendants. Annie's book entwines personal history with the epistolary and persona poems in the voices of composer Domenico Scarlatti and castrato and opera singer Farinelli. And so these are really fascinating books to me to have in conversation with one another. And actually, I'm going to introduce Shara now so that she can go ahead and read right after Annie. So I don't have to get in the way of everybody in the middle. So from Jamaica, Shara McCallum has published 6 books in the US and UK, including her most recent, No Ruined Stone, which is this one. An anthology of her poems translated into Spanish, History is a Room, was published in 2021 in Mexico. McCallum is an Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of English at Penn State University, also teaches in the Pacific University Low-Res MFA program, and was appointed the 2021-22 Penn State Poet Laureate. So I'm going to go ahead and let Annie lead us into the reading. She'll read for about 15 minutes, and then Shara will read.
Great. Thank you so much, Erika. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so privileged and honored to be a co-reader with Shara, whom I have heard of and I've read works by for years now. So it is wonderful to be here, even though I'm actually physically in New York City today. I wanted to read several poems for folks today that come from these historical persona poems that you mentioned, since that's the focus of our panel. But my book is a little bit weird and woolly in the sense that it combines both a very present day autobiographical path that comes from my own life and is about grappling with some childhood trauma and family issues in music, as well as the lives of these two musicians that you've mentioned. So the first poem I'm going to read is actually kind of like the foreword to the book, and it's a prose poem that sets up the rest of the book. It's called Confession. The book in the library was yellow, like the sun in a framed tapestry, titled simply Domenico Scarlatti. I took it to an alcove where morning light streamed in through the picture window behind me, open to the flyleaf, and read. Story, a thing tangled up with something else. Eros, what tangles them? What I wanted on that clear summer morning was not biography, but passion, to dive like a small blue whale into the ocean. The hunt is rarely about the thing. Scarlatti, composer son of a famous composer whose more than 550 keyboard sonatas, largely unpublished at his death in 1757, are the music of a divided self. Father, gambler, bankrupt. Castrato, one who cuts his body to preserve his voice. Farinelli, Castrato's singer, the most celebrated in all of Europe, Scarlatti's friend, who quit the opera stage to sing each night to Mad Philip V of Spain, whose body, like Saint Sebastian's in the Burns sculpture that I love, twists even as it's pierced. To be a thief, you must love what you steal. I saw that I could write myself into their shadows, that I would need to pierce myself. Counterpoint, the art of building by pursuing more than one melodic line, each independent but connected to the other. So in writing about Farinelli, the first of these musicians, the castrato, I have a number of monologues and dialogues with him and Scarlatti and some letters. So I'm going to start that section of the poems I'm reading today with one of the monologues. And it's in his voice, first person, and it's set in the 1720s. Ghost. Alone on the dressing room floor, I sink, back against the wall, wood beneath my feet. I was good tonight. Good in all the roles, calling for heartbreak, peeling back the paper from the fruit, like a moon untouched. No one's left but the man who will drive me home tonight. Wheels over cobblestone, lamps by the river. Supper laid with silver, Venetian crystal. Sometimes a face appears between the flames. My hands beneath the table open, close. It's not that I can feel every heartbreak. Each has a face that I create. Ghost in the stage light, twirling, rising, smoke for an instant. Until my raised hand drops, my head bows and the house shakes with applause, with pleasure, joy, effort of heartbreak. My feet bear me down the dark steps backstage. I am happy at this moment, ravenous. The next thing I'm going to read is a letter from Farinelli, whose real name was Carlo Broschi, to his older brother, Riccardo Broschi, who was also a musician and a composer like his father, and who sometimes wrote things for Farinelli to sing. So this is from the early time when he gets to the Spanish court, and it's set in Madrid in the winter in 1727. It's a couple of different letters collaged together. Dear Riccardo, no time tonight to write more than a scrap, dear brother. You're correct. I leave for Madrid tomorrow. All is settled. I've barely touched ground since leaving the court. She had the wildest eyes, the Spanish queen, clutching my hand, whispering in my ear so others near us couldn't hear. You must come. Only the beauty of your voice can save him. Then tumbling from my lips, unaware, yes, I must be mad, brother, as mad as he, to depart from this land, for God knows, sitting here all alone, all the dear old possessions, which made a life sinking into shadows. I barely know the man writing these lines. Your faithful Carlo. All you've heard about El Escorial, colossal, bare, full of drafts and sackcloth, is, I'm afraid, true. We have no comforts, unless you count stone and iron comforts. I've never climbed up a damper stairwell. Thank God the court's annual stay here is brief. I can barely wait for winter, when the whole palace flees to Oranjes, land of orange groves and plashing fountains. It remains to be seen, brother, what role I create for myself at the court. I have my harpsichords, my books and paintings coming. I can leave the palace at all hours, except when singing to the king. For now, that is enough. Picture me in good health, as I will picture you, walking every night beneath the shade trees in father's garden. Send me the new aria you've written, the one with the exiled prince in moonlight. Give my best to mother. Spare her details you think would cause her suffering. My thoughts and all my love I send across the ocean. A few lines more before I close this letter. My nightly audience, you asked, how is he? What can I say, brother, in words alone? He is a body crouched behind the curtains, a hand, mainly bones, the shuffle of linen. He rasps and rocks and occasionally howls. When he does, only an ancient servant, one who nursed him as a boy, rushes in. Only she can comfort him, good woman. I do my part. What do you guys sing but your own dear Ombra Fideli Anch'io? Faithful shade indeed. I stand in darkness by the foot of a bed enclosed by drapes so thick I think of dark confession boxes. Imagine something worse. Curtains opened only a hand's width, enough for one pair of wolf's eyes, hungry, yellow in the flame. I sing of love, of course, and ships and sailors pining for the shore. My voice oddly still, my voice. There are nights when he barely breathes, when his whole body strains to listen. I hear his silence. And once, just once, after my last held note, I heard his voice within the curtains. Again, I want to hear that song again. Your faithful Carlo. And then the last thing that I'll read is a part of a dialogue. So there are a number of dialogues in this book between Farnelli and Scarlatti. They're imagined, of course, as the two became friends. So this one comes from fairly early in their friendship, also set in Madrid in the 1730s. And that the name of this section is called Everything Swims. So the first voice I should tell you is Scarlatti. What do you remember about your father? Scarlatti's voice emerges from his chair. Past midnight, portraits of the royal family staring down at us from walls candlelit, high, lonely faces, white as altar marbles. I raise my glass to them in a silent toast. Everything strong and good, I suppose. Decent, a loving husband, father, able composer. And you? What made you think of this just now? The same, of course. Oh, the man was perfect. Imagine his mind is a library, his hands opening his strong hands for octaves, tenths, two banks of the vast ocean. Inside them, everything swims, including you. He wipes his lips. Why then don't you want to write an opera? You wrote many operas as a young man, I continue, leaning in, like your father. And have you heard these fine works? Enough world, my friend, exists already. Look around you. Why create false ones with gods and heroes? You were young, I think, when your father died. I slush the wine in my glass. Strange how separate a thing can feel, even in your hand. You'll never be it. Not so young. You premiered in London, practically a child, that I know. By 20, I would guess, you'd made all the money you would want from the stage. I take a long sip. Of the things he loved, independence was what he loved the best. My father wanted his sons to owe no one. Splendid, you've done exactly what he wished. I suppose, dear Musico, I'm jealous. I suppose I could have lived a different life, spent my energies differently, not squandered. Lost in some reflection, he grows silent. Thank you, I'll stop there.
So I will just say, first of all, Annie, I feel such joy in reading with you. And I'd read your first book when it came out. And then when we were reading together and I got Eros, Unbroken, I was just really marveling at how brilliant the Virginia Festival of the Book was in putting us together. It's just an incredible, beautiful collection. And Erika, thank you for moderating this. I look forward to the conversation. Thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Book for having us here, and for all of you for listening. I'm going to just read a few poems from the collection, which, as Erika mentioned, is an imaginative account of an alternate account of history. It is taken out of one moment in the life of the 18th century Scottish poet Robert Burns, which is that he almost went to Jamaica to work on a slave plantation. And I have written this book that imagines what would have happened had he gone. So it is really an intervention into the actual historical record. Interwoven throughout are real events in Jamaican and Scottish history, as well as ones that I have created, fictional characters, as well as fictive versions of real people. All of it set in the 18th and then early 19th century. And I think that will help to know that before I start. Unlike what Annie chose, and I thought it was really beautiful, the way that you interwove the personal stakes with the characters and the personae, I have actually segregated myself to some extent. So the first and the last poem are the title poems, so to speak, of the collection, and they're the ones that are in my voice. I'll read both of those, and then I'll read a couple poems in the voice of the main and dominant characters in this book, Robert Burns in the first half, and then his imagined granddaughter in the second. So this is me, the poet, speaking to Burns. No ruined stone. You saturate the sight of those who come after, poets and painters alike. Your words invade my mind's listening, manacle my tongue when I try to speak. On all I backward cast my eye and fear and cannot see. Who would I have been to you? What stone in the ruined house of the past? In this world, I am unloosed, belonging to no country, no tribe, no clan, not African, not Scotland. And you, voice that stalks my waking and dreaming, you, more myth than man, cannot unmake history. So why am I here, resurrecting you to speak, when your silence gulfs centuries? Why do I find myself on your doorstep, knocking, when I know the dead will never answer? So that was the first poem I wrote, and then I proceeded to resurrect the dead. Specifically in this first half of the book, Robert Burns, he travels to Jamaica, becomes an overseer on the Springbank plantation in Port Antonio, the real place he would have gone to. And among many things that happened in the last 10 years of his life, that he lives transplanted now in that geography, continues to try to be the great poet, songwriter. All of those things will happen for Burns. They just won't happen in his lifetime in my book. They happen when he's dead instead. And one other thing that, of course, many people who know Burns know that he, as we would say in Jamaica, had many baby mothers. So in this book, the women he meets are enslaved African women, and he engages in a multi-year relationship with one of them who is a pivotal figure in this book. Her name is Nancy. I think that's all you need to know to hear this. This is a love poem Burns writes for Nancy, for promised joy. Suffer me to want her. Suffer me to ask for nothing but laughter, hers filling the drafts and breathing hollows of my room. Each time she enters, suffer me to be suffused in scent of her, my eyes condemned by sight of her. Suffer me to ask love to dwell in a place not meant for love's habitation, in vain to take what is mine and not mine, to theft from brutality, beauty, without hesitation, without thought of consequence. Suffer me to face love's cruelty that knows no boundary. And toward the end of his time, many things are happening, of course, including the entire time slavery is going on, enslaved people are, of course, revolting. So the institution of slavery is only maintained by incredible amounts of violence and force, as we know. In Jamaica, the mortality rate is particularly grotesque, about 4 years after arrival for many enslaved people. So that's happening, these kinds of backdrops of these insurrections the slaves have mounted. And this is toward the end of Burns' time here. Annie, I chose this poem because you read one where we have actual echoes of language. Often in this book, Burns is writing back to his brother, Gilbert, who's back home in Scotland. So this is Rising. Day and night the mountains speak. From distant fields lit by fire, day and night comes the drumming that will not cease, fomenting fear in every planter, stirring restlessness and desire amongst the slaves. Nearly 3 decades have passed since Tacky's rebellion failed, and Nanny, now rumored dead. Yet memory survives, their spirits roaming these hills as the threat of the next rising gathers like rain clouds on the horizon. To incant the names of the dead is to invite the charge of treason. So silence becomes the cost extracted from every man who labors beneath the boot heel of history. Dear brother, this letter will never reach. Like so many others of late, they are as fragments of dream thrashing in my head. Or should I commit even one rashly to the page, I would fast tear that sheet to shreds, burn it to cinder and ash. Soon enough, I will be called to account for my sins. So what could it matter now to confess them to you or any other? Brother, what would I say in truth? But I have borne witness to, been reluctant participant in madness. I have watched as all of us are bound by fate, cruel twine ordained, not by any law of God or nature, but of this world we have designed, this world where profit is the first and last word, violence, both rule and reason. So in the second half of the book, this main speaker is Isabella. And Isabella is the granddaughter of Robert Burns. And I'll read a poem that explains how she comes to be in Scotland in 1825. She is born into slavery. She is the granddaughter also of Nancy. And her father is the master of the plantation who rapes the daughter of Burns and Nancy. So it's a complicated ancestry, but quite frankly, common as dirt in the annals of slavery. So Springbank is her description of how she gets to where she is now. Was all the world I'd known, a child there, I was hers, Miss Nancy's kin. No matter this skin, these eyes belonging to his face. Your father could not look at you without seeing disgrace, was the only answer she'd relent to offer. Even when her life waned, she would not unlock the past. Tell me what she'd said that made him let us go. Why he paid and paid to send us away and away. We left first for Kingston, and a door closed behind us, a door I was never meant to open again. In Kingston, my grandmother was passed off as my slave. By the time our ship docked in Greenock, she was my servant, and we threaded into a tale so tightly woven, no one would guess my origin. What she sacrificed was everything of herself to see me freed. But my father, you kent him and his world so intimately. What I've surmised will be no surprise. What Douglas understood was expedience. I was simply evidence. I needed to be erased. And I'm just trying to keep a time check so that we have time for conversation. I'll read two more poems and then open up for us to chat. I think one of the many characters in this book is memory. And one of the types of memory that Isabella is being particularly haunted by, what happens is that her grandmother has died. So the only person who knows the truth of Isabella's ancestry, she's passing for white, is her grandmother. And now her grandmother is gone. And in the wake of her grandmother's death, Isabella begins to have recollections of memories that are not about her crossing from Jamaica to Scotland, but about her grandmother's crossing on the Middle Passage. It's a kind of memory scientists study and they call epigenetic memory. It is one that is found in a lot of the ancestors of survivors of trauma. And this is one of the kinds of hauntings and the sorts of characters of memory that Isabella is coming to terms with. One of her main questions is how can she continue to pass and not dishonor her ancestors? And this is one of those poems. In the field. In the field lies the shipwrecked ship, broken mast and riggings, resembling an angel or bird fallen from a high place. Wings splayed, feathers like a halo of the body. In the field, I wonder the body of night, bereft of sight or made bereft by sight of this vessel, stranded in a clearing, never meant to hold its form, unable to conjure the shape of longing every ship contains. In this dream of the field, I am the absence of ship, its hollowed out hull, the waves, the voices of the drowned beating against my ribs. And I cannot stop the cries, and I cannot unstopper my ears, as all night comes the tolling. Why have you survived, if not for this? So Isabella's story ends when she makes the decision whether or not to pass. I don't tell you what happens after. whether her husband, who doesn't know the truth of her ancestry, accepts her, whether she claims her inheritance as Burns' granddaughter, because there's a heyday happening after he's dead, and everybody's celebrating this grandfather she can't claim without betraying her ancestry. So I just say all of that because at the end of the book, instead, I choose to come back and speak as the poet, and this is the final poem I'll read. No ruined stone. When the dead return, they will come to you in dream, and in waking will be the bird, knocking against glass, seeking a way in, will masquerade as the wind, its voice made audible by the tongues of leaves, greedily lapping, as the waves' self-made fugue is a turning and returning. The dead will not then, nor ever again, desert you. Their unrest will be the coat cloaking you. The farther you journey from them, the more distance will maw in you. Time and place gulching when the dead return to demand accounting. Wanting and wanting and wanting everything you have to give, and nothing will quench or unhunger them as they take all you make as offering, then tell you to begin again. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Shara, and thank you, Annie. It was so wonderful to hear your poems come to life. And one of the things that stood out to me too is how many synchronicities there are between your poems, just in terms of themes as well, of love, beauty, art making, trauma, and memory. And I think that really came through in the reading. I want to take a minute to encourage our audience, if you have questions as we go for the poets, to please drop them into the Q&A, which you can access on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We would love to take questions from the audience. I have some questions too for both of the poets, but we'd love for this to be more interactive that way. And so the other thing I would encourage everybody to do as well is get these two wonderful books from the UVA bookstore, which is the bookseller for the Virginia Festival of the Book. So we don't so far have any questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some questions that I have. And if anything pops up, I'll go ahead and field it. So I was thinking a lot about the part of Shara's author note in her book that says the resulting poems and the characters are works of imagination and speculative history. The poems offer an account of an alternate past. And it got me thinking about the idea in both of your books that there's a really interesting balance between imagination and history. And so I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about the balance between imagination and research in your work, and sort of staying close to certain historical events or pieces of information versus what you felt like you were able to imagine. And even if the poem itself maybe becomes like a third field where these two elements can meet and mingle and make something totally new.
That's a wonderful question, Erika. Annie, do you want to go first? Would you like me to
Why
start?
don't you start, since we just heard from you? Yeah.
I mean, what I will say is I think the use of history in my case is one in which the historical record doesn't have an account of what it is I really need to talk about, which is the ancestry that I carry. And so, you know, in a way to answer this is to say, I'm constantly threading the backdrop of the history that we record. So the history that is there as public record with more ancestral histories that I know would have existed. I said that about Isabella's ancestry. You know, 30% of the owners on Jamaican plantations were Scottish. There's nowhere virtually in Scottish history that speaks of the enslaved people, of the owners of these, you know, it's a history Scotland in particular has been pretty late in wanting to deal with, as many countries are late in wanting to deal with the history of slavery. So that's just one thought I have in response, Erika, this is a history that is totally implicated by and imbricated in the recorded history, as well as what is missing from that history. And that's where the imagination, I think, can answer those omissions.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that I would agree with from what Shara just said. Not a whole lot remains to us of how castrati singers lived and worked. I actually got drawn into writing about Farnelli and Scarlatti because I'm an amateur violinist. I've always liked Scarlatti's music, and I was listening to one of his sonatas one day, and I thought, wow, this guy sounds really modern and also just kind of crazy. Like he just goes from this happy, sunny mode to all these depths and darkness. So I started Googling and researching. So I was definitely drawn in by historical curiosity, but I was pretty interested in not writing about anything historical because my first book had been so much about Korean cultural history and family history and all the holes there. So I was really trying to push that away. And instead, of course, I got yoked in and I started going down this rabbit hole, you know, reading all I could about Farnelli and Scarlatti. I just discovered that there's so little left to us about Scarlatti and relatively more about Farnelli. So we can read a whole set of letters to Farnelli from one of his good friends, who was a poet and librettist at the time, Metastasio, but we really don't have letters of his own. There are lots of historical accounts of both of them, and we know that they were friends. We know all these things about some markers of their lives that come forward in the book. So the historical dimension definitely animated my original interest in this, and it sparked throughout the book. But I was mostly interested in creating an emotional portrait of both characters. And I guess I'm the third. So I guess it's a strange, you know, hybrid emotional family portrait. The two characters who were, you know, based on real men who lived and me. And so both of these figures had very dominant fathers, and their fathers played a big role in their lives. So Scarlatti was the less famous Scarlatti, actually. His father was a prolific opera composer, as you heard in one of the poems, and kind of dominated his life for the early years. Farnelli lost his father when he was young, but that was probably a motivating factor for him to get castrated. And that was not uncommon in the day for young Italian boys and other boys to find a way to make a profession and a living, to make art by mutilating themselves. It was just a thing you did. And so I thought that was really powerful. It resonated with my own interest in examining my relationship with my mother and some of the traumas and difficulties there. And so this all kind of swirled together, you know? So I guess I projected the most, I guess, and was most imaginative, or took the most liberties in thinking about the emotional pieces of their stories. But I did want to leave intact everything else that was historically knowable about them. I didn't want to change any of that. These are two important historical figures, two really important musicians. I didn't want to alter any of that. So I hope I was faithful to it. But it was, yeah, I don't think I'll ever write a book like this again.
No, I feel the same. I want to just add to that, to one other thought responding to Annie, is that it was 3 years of research, and I felt very committed to putting Burns in particular, his life in motion, but through the biography and through the actual facts of what was going on in Scotland and Jamaica. And even with Isabella, who's wholly imagined, it's very much, you know, I wanted there to be believability, that this could be a person, this could have happened. And I think you do that, Annie, so really beautifully. The threading together in your collection and the emotional threading is very present.
So we actually have a bunch of questions from the audience.
Awesome.
Before we get to them, though, I want to kind of ask a connected question, and then I'm going to go over to the audience questions, just because both of you brought it up a little bit. So I'm curious about the role of letter writing and epistolary poems in your book, and what that form in particular allowed you to do, or why you felt it was generative for you. And then we have some great questions from the audience I want to go over to.
Sure. Shall I start us off this time?
I think so, yeah.
Sure. So I think it's a great question, and both of our books have a number of letters, and it's the brother connection is there as well, which is really fun. You know, in contemporary poetry right now, you mostly have an implied invisible reader, and so it's actually a lot of fun to write a letter poem in which you have an explicit reader, and you're kind of writing into that. It gives you a slant. It's sort of like looking at a submarine window or something. You see the world in a different way. And so with only a couple of words, you can also start sketching a lot about the mindset and the circumstances of both the reader of the letter and the writer of the letter. So it's a really fun form for writers, if for those of you who write poems or fiction. And so for me, I was looking for a way to quickly explain some background circumstances in a way that didn't feel like exposition. I needed to do some storytelling, and I wanted to do it in a way that had emotional resonance. So I found that the letter form worked well for that. And that's how the Dear Ricardo letters came into being, including the ones that I read. So it also made sense because in the day, Farnelli would have written lots of letters to his brother. We know he wrote lots of letters to his friends. And so that was a good way also of doing it in the first person. So Farnelli speaking directly to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. I just agree with everything Annie said, so I'll add a few things that not to repeat exactly that. One is that for me, the letter is just a form of the dramatic monologue. So in terms of whenever I'm thinking about a dramatic monologue, I'm always thinking about what's provoking the speaker to speak and to whom are they speaking. It may be that it's a general you, but it's often not. And having a direct point of address, it creates a lot more intimacy as well as urgency for the speech act that is the monologue. It's also that, you know, in this case, Burns is speaking sometimes in letters and Isabella's writing to people who can't hear them. And I want to say that too, is that I play with that deliberately in Burns's section, that you get to the end and you don't know anymore which of those letters Gilbert ever received. We write letters also to speak to ourselves. We give monologues because the person we're speaking to cannot listen to us. And I think there's that interesting tension in wanting the audience, but recognizing, and Isabella is speaking to her grandfather who's dead, and she's speaking to her husband who doesn't know anything she's telling him because he thinks he's married to a white woman. And so there's that tension that happens. And then the final thing I'd say is then the you is also always us. So the great thing about this form and just dramatic monologues, period, is you get multiple kinds of audiences at once, and into that floods dramatic irony. So the speaker of each monologue is saying something, and we as the audience will hear it differently than the intended recipient, because 200 years later, Burns's words will mean something different, or Isabella's 150 years later. So I love that layering effect of audience as well as of just getting time in to the poem in interesting ways.
Thank you. So I think this is actually a great place. We have a question from an audience member named Jennifer that asks, when you write in these other voices, is there a kind of possession by them of your own poet's voice? And I think that's a really interesting question in conjunction with this question around dramatic monologue. So I'm hoping one or both of you could speak to that a little bit.
Do you want to start that one, Cheryl? I can.
Sure. I will say, you know, with Burns, his was the harder one to get to. Thanks, Jennifer. That's a really great question. When I got to the point where I could write as Burns, it is because I didn't know where his syntax ended and mine began anymore. And so I had done enough, I think, reading of his poems and his letters and his songs. There's so much. If anybody knows Burns' work intimately, they will see very, very quickly that his words are all throughout this book. And I recast them in this voice of Burns in Jamaica to let us hear the irony of some of what he says. I recast them in Isabella's mouth so that we also hear what she's calling him out for in a way, his abandonments, his desire and ambition for his own poetry that eclipsed others from his sight in front of him. And so I think there's the beauty of, finding a voice of a character. For me, is very much about finding the language that would create the voice on the page, since there's nothing else in performance of a monologue. It's different. We have the body as our instrument, as actors or deliverers of a monologue. You only have diction, and that's about it, really, and syntax as a poet to create character and tone. And I really liberally drew upon Burns's own diction in order to do so.
That's so interesting to hear. I love hearing that, Shara. I could not do that because, they probably would have spoken to each other in Italian. And I don't have any evidence of what they did say to each other. But, going to Jennifer's question, writing those dialogues in particular between Farnelli and Scarlatti were some of the happiest moments of my writing this book. I just loved it. I'm not a fiction writer, and so these were my deepest dives into something like fiction, but it felt both really intimate and also kind of generous in a way because it wasn't just my point of view for what it's worth. I was trying to find a way to distinguish the sound of these dialogues and letters from the sound of the autobiographical poems. I didn't read any of those poems today, but those are much more fragmented, free verse, they're rangy, they include some prose, they zigzag back and forth in time, pronouns shift. So those are quite different. And so I was trying to stick with something like a 10-syllable or decasyllabic line throughout the dialogues, nothing that rhymes, nothing that feels too strongly metrical, but something that feels just a little bit more elevated, a little bit more archaic. But yeah, I think the biggest thing I'll take away is that I liked being in their voices. It definitely expanded things for me. And I loved creating that friendship through the writing.
Oop, thank you. So I want to ask a question that also dovetails with an audience member's question, which is Beverly's, but I'm going to ask it in a little bit of a broader way. So I'm interested in one of the things I think that is right now something as a teacher of poetry that is of great concern and distress in some cases to my students is how do you write the other? How do you write another? And so I'm hoping maybe both of you can talk a little bit about your positionality in relation to your characters, what resonated with you with your characters, and what gave you what were the points of connection that allowed you to feel like you could speak in some cases for and through them, I think is something that's really interesting and also dovetails with Beverly's question.
I can start if you'd like, Annie. I think we've been going back and forth. I've lost count of where we are in the volley now. But,
you're doing so well in passing back and forth between each other that I haven't intervened.
Okay. I'll say this. I think this question for me, nobody's going to ask this about Isabella because this is about cultural appropriation. And so because I'm a woman of color, because I'm not only a woman of color, but I'm a Black woman who looks white, people are going to presume in a way that I have this right. I think it misses the point, which is really when you're going to create a voice, because I'm not Isabella, right? What have you done? What work ethically have you done, not just aesthetically, to create a voice that is not doing harm to others? To me, that is the reason to really dig down directly into this question. I had to ask it a lot in this book. And it's not about, do you have a right to do it? It's about, why are you doing it? And what is the cost to other people for your appropriating a voice and a story? To some extent, we are always doing that as writers, but it's not, I think the degrees matter. I think it's not okay just to say that's just what writers do. With Burns, I ask myself that a lot. And what I come down on is that I love Burns's work and I love the vision of that work. And this is not a book I wrote out of some sort of desire to only present one singular thread of narrative, and that was a guidepost for me, that I knew that I wanted to grapple with the vexations of history rather than just maligning someone. That's not an impulse I tend to write out of. And also, to me, it's like, slavery is a grotesque institution, and that is not an argument that I would be that interested in making, because it is self-evident. The more interesting, right, ethical argument is, what do people who think of themselves as good, which everybody does, who do bad things and who are imbricated fully in it and implicated in it, what does that look like? What is the consequence of that to that person and to their descendants and to all of us? So I would say, like, those are the what I mean when I say ask yourself the ethical questions. And for me also, just last thing I'll say, this history needs to be told, because there are people who the consequence for not hearing it, myself and others, is unbearable. And so there's a risk you take, but for me, there has to be a reason too, and that's the reason.
I absolutely agree with what Shara said. The stakes for me were quite different. Obviously, I don't have a lot in common with two dead white 18th century men, one of whom was castrated as a youth. I did think long and hard about whether I could pull this off and whether it would be offensive to somebody or seem like a strange act in some way. I think I felt a sense of commonality because I am also a musician, though not a professional by any means. And so the love of music and my love of Scarlatti's music brought me in a way that felt authentic. And then, as I mentioned, the emotional resonance, the idea of these people grappling with the legacies of their fathers, that felt true to me. Sometimes in poetry classes, I've talked with students about truth versus factual or evidentiary truth. And I might add here maybe something like emotional or psychic truth. So I felt there was a lot of psychic truth there in my relationship to these two characters. One of the things that I didn't read from the book is an important opening sequence in the book called Violence. And in it, it's an autobiographical poem that goes back and forth a lot between times. But I talk about the violin as a very, very resilient, but also fragile wooden body that only produces music when you act on it with violence in a way. You've got to carve out the holes. You've got to pull the bow across the strings, make the sound waves invade the sound post inside the violin. That's how you make music. And so this idea of having to act in a violent, sometimes traumatic way on bodies and objects. And in the end, though maybe that was not a justification, you produce art, you produce music. That is something also that ties together, I think, the autobiographical strand in my book with the idea of castration. So one of the poems I didn't read goes into Farinelli's recollection of that time. And that was probably the hardest thing for me to write, because I also did not want to presume too much. And I didn't want to, in some strange way, invade the privacy of a long deceased person, and especially be too on the nose about sexuality. But I thought the castration, the sacrifice that went into preserving and maintaining this beautiful voice was really important. So that was probably the most the difficult thing to write about.
I think it's good to have that fear. I certainly had it as well, Annie. It keeps you honest. To the fear that you can't pull this off, and that you might, and for me, it was also, I'm taking someone's national hero. It is hard to state the degree to which Robert Burns is, synonymous with Scottish identity and culture. And we don't have anything like that in the United States to compare it to. So fear is a good, to me, humbling emotion in the face of something like this to feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine that.
Mhm.
So we are fast coming to the end of our time. I think we might have time for one more super fast question, which kind of dovetails with Yasmin's question in the Q&A, which is why poetry for these projects? Why this form rather than fiction?
Yeah, I can start us off. One easy pragmatic answer is that I'm not really a fiction writer. So I wanted to tell this complicated story. It was like I wanted to graft two tree trunks together and have them grow into one tree. And that's the story of the 18th century musicians and my own story. And that also meant that I couldn't spend a terribly long time on either part of the story. I am a poet, even though I use a lot of collage and essayistic work. And so verse allowed me to do that. I think also when you write verse letters or monologues or dialogues, you're not always telling a linear, cohesive, detailed story. Most often you're not. And so you can tell the story through fragments. You can get a lot conveyed through tone and images and voice. And so in some ways, it's a more economical way of doing narrative. So I like that challenge as well. But I also could not imagine writing a 300-page novel about these two.
Yeah, so I'll just echo Annie and then add something different, perhaps a little bit, which is I'm also not a fiction writer, but I did mount a book architecturally that is structured like a novel. And so things do happen in this book, and I put things in motion and had to ask the novelist question, what happens next and why? And so that was a fascinating process as a writer who usually does not deal with those kinds of consequences. As an essayist and a poet, these are not things that I'm particularly obsessed by. But I will also say that I think poetry has this in it and has always had it in it. And I do love all of the modes of poetry and always have loved drama, storytelling, and song. The lyric, the epic, the dramatic, and the epic now being the narrative, right? We don't call things epic as much. But I think that's the history of poetry. So I felt poetry was up to the task. The question was whether I was up to the task. But it's great to give yourself a challenge. This, like Annie, I will just say, I'm very, very grateful to have spent time with and wrestled with this book and written it. And I hope to do something very different next too. So, yeah.
So thank you both. This was fabulous. I am so happy we got to talk about your books after your reading. So it's time for us to wrap things up. Thank you to Annie Kim and Shara McCallum, and everybody who tuned in with us. Please consider buying their books from your local bookseller or through the links on VA Book that are up on their website and also in the chat. You can also check out future festival events and watch past events at vabook.org. So thank you, everybody. And thank you especially Shara and Annie.
Thank you so much, Erika and Shara. It was wonderful to be with both of you. And thank you, the Festival of the Book.
Ditto, ditto, and wonderful to be with all of you who came to listen and ask questions.
Take care, everybody.